My daughter left a voicemail while I was in surgery prep, not a text. A voicemail, which meant she'd calculated that I wouldn't answer. 14 seconds long. I played it 3 times in the recovery room before the sedative fully wore off. Dad, we made a decision about the firm. It's already done. Don't worry about coming back. I set the phone face down on the hospital blanket. The IV line pulled against my wrist. Outside the window, the Nashville skyline sat gray and indifferent under a February sky, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the city looked exactly the same as it had that morning, before everything changed. My name is on the deed of every building my company ever developed, 31 years of that name meaning something. And my daughter had just told me, in 14 seconds, not to come back. I didn't call her. Not yet. I had a hip replacement scheduled for 7:15 a.m. The orthopedic surgeon said I'd be walking without a cane within 6 weeks. I was 63 years old, in reasonable health, clear-minded, and apparently, according to my daughter and her husband, no longer relevant to the company I built from a single spec house in Brentwood in 1992. Her name is Caroline. She's 41. She joined Mercer Development Group 11 years ago, which is what I named the firm after my late wife, Eleanor. Caroline's husband, a man named Gavin Strauss, came aboard 4 years after that. He had an MBA from Vanderbilt and a handshake that lasted slightly too long. Eleanor never trusted him. She used to say he smiled with just his mouth. She died of pancreatic cancer 6 years ago. And after that, I made the mistake that most grieving men in their 60s make. I stepped back, not fully. Not from the company, but from the daily decisions, the contractor calls, the permit hearings, the site walks. I started delegating in ways I hadn't before, partly from grief, partly from a genuine belief that Caroline was ready. I gave her the title of Chief Operating Officer 18 months after Eleanor passed. I kept my own title, President and sole shareholder, or so I believed. The morning I went into surgery, I had no reason to think otherwise. The voicemail changed that. By the time a nurse brought me a cup of weak hospital coffee at 900 a.m., I had a text from my attorney, a woman named Patricia Hollis, asking me to call when I was up to it. Patricia has handled my business and estate matters for 19 years. She does not send casual texts. I called her from the recovery room. Tell me, I said. She exhaled slowly. That exhale told me more than the next 10 minutes of conversation did. Gavin had filed amended articles of incorporation with the Tennessee Secretary of State 2 days before my surgery. The amendment restructured the company's ownership, diluting my shares from 100% to 22% and redistributing the remaining 78% to Caroline and Gavin through a newly formed holding entity called Strauss Advisory Group, LLC. He used a power of attorney I had signed 14 months earlier. After Eleanor died, Caroline had asked me to sign it. She said it was for emergencies. She said, "Dad, what if something happens during one of your trips and you can't reach a phone?" I was 61 and had just buried my wife. I signed it on a Thursday afternoon in this very office while Caroline sat across from me looking tired and sympathetic and entirely convincing. I did not speak for a long moment after Patricia finished explaining. "Can he do this?" I asked. "He attempted to," she said carefully. "Whether it holds is a different question." What's the different question? Whether the POA authorizes amendments to corporate governance. It was drafted for personal financial matters, real estate transactions, medical decisions, banking, not for restructuring a privately held corporation's capitalization. I looked at the ceiling. White acoustic tile. Same as every hospital in America. "Find out," I said. "I already started," she said. "There's something else." There was always something else. "The Alderton contract," Patricia said. Alderton was a 72-unit mixed-use development in East Nashville, the biggest project Mercer Development had ever taken on, signed last fall. Groundbreaking scheduled for April. I had spent 8 months negotiating that deal personally, walking the site, managing the city council relationship, building the financing structure. What about it? The executed agreement lists Strauss Advisory Group as the development entity, not Mercer Development Group. I set the coffee cup down. When was it changed? The version filed with Metro Nashville Planning shows Strauss Advisory as of January 14th. I had gone into surgery on February 3rd. Gavin had been moving pieces for at least 3 weeks before I ever went under anesthesia. My phone buzzed. Caroline, I let it ring. I spent 2 nights in the hospital. Standard for a hip replacement at my age. I used that time the way I've used quiet time my whole career. Not to recover, but to think. I've spent 31 years in development, which means I've spent 31 years reading documents other people assumed I wouldn't read carefully. Contractors, lenders, city officials. Everyone assumes the principal is too busy or too proud to read the fine print. That assumption has cost a lot of people a lot of money over the years. It was about to cost Gavin Strauss everything. Patricia came to my hospital room on the second evening. She brought 2 folders and a yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting, which was small and exact and looked nothing like the digital age she worked in. She sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed and opened the first folder. The POA, she said, was drafted by a paralegal in my office 14 months ago. I reviewed it personally. It covers personal property transactions, healthcare decisions, and banking up to $50,000. It does not, under any reasonable interpretation, extend to corporate governance. So the amendment is invalid. Almost certainly. But he filed it. It's in the state record. We need to contest it formally and get it vacated. How long? If we move quickly, 30 to 60 days. In the meantime, I've sent a letter to Alderton Group's legal counsel, notifying them of a dispute over the contracting entity's authorization. I nodded. And Alderton's reaction? She allowed herself a small smile. Concern. Alderton was a family-owned commercial developer out of Atlanta. 3rd generation, conservative. They did not like surprises. They particularly did not like legal disputes appearing mid-contract. Patricia knew this. I had been counting on it. There's more, she said. Opening the second folder, there was always more. Gavin had approached 2 of Mercer's 3 active lenders 6 weeks ago. He had represented himself in writing as the authorized managing partner of Mercer Development Group under a transition of leadership. He had requested modifications to loan covenant terms on both accounts, citing a change in operational structure. One lender had granted a preliminary modification. The other had flagged the request and called my personal cell, which I had missed because I was at a pre-op appointment. He told them there was a transition of leadership, I repeated. Yes, while I was still running the company. Yes. I looked out the window. The Cumberland River was just visible between 2 buildings. Asnor and I used to walk along the river on Sunday mornings when the kids were small, and Nashville was a different city. Pull Gavin's personal financials, I said. Whatever is reachable. Business filings, court records, any pending liens. Patricia nodded as if she'd already started. She had. By the following morning, when an orderly helped me take my first post-surgery steps down the hospital corridor, I had a clearer picture. Gavin Strauss had launched a side venture 2 years ago, a boutique development consultancy operating under a different LLC, advising smaller residential builders in the Murfreesboro corridor. The consultancy had taken on 2 investor partners. One of those partnerships had soured. There was a pending arbitration. The consultancy was not generating income, and Gavin had borrowed against his personal assets, including his share of the house he and Caroline owned jointly, to the point where his debt service was becoming uncomfortable. The Alderton contract, with its projected development fees, would have solved his problem cleanly. He wasn't stealing from me out of ambition. He was stealing from me out of desperation. That distinction mattered, not because it made it more forgivable, but because it made him more predictable. I was discharged on a Thursday. My assistant, a retired military man named Dale who had worked with me for 9 years, picked me up and drove me not home but to Patricia's office on West End Avenue. I walked in on a cane. Patricia was already at the conference table. Across from her sat a man I recognized from his online profile, mid-50s, compact, the kind of face that gave nothing away. A forensic accountant named Raymond Shue, who Patricia had retained 2 days earlier. Raymond had spent those 2 days doing what he does. Gavin borrowed against future development fee income, Raymond said without preamble. Specifically, he structured a personal loan 12 months ago using anticipated Alderton fees as collateral. The lender is a private credit fund out of Franklin. The loan amount is $340,000. He borrowed against fees he hadn't yet earned, I said. From a project he didn't yet control, Raymond added. He needed the Alderton contract under Strauss Advisory's name to validate the collateral. Without it, the loan defaults. Patricia folded her hands, which means the corporate restructuring wasn't primarily about taking control of Mercer Development. It was about legitimizing a collateral claim he'd already made. The room was very quiet. He bet the money before he had the cards, I said. Raymond nodded once. I looked at the legal pad in front of me. A cup of coffee sat beside it, the good kind. Patricia kept a proper machine in the conference room. I wrapped my hands around it and felt the warmth and thought about the last time I had sat in a room like this, negotiating a deal, completely in command of the facts, and how natural it felt to be back. The private credit fund, I said. Who holds the note? Raymond slid a document across the table. I read the name of the fund. Then I looked at Patricia. Is that fund's portfolio traded? It's a closed private vehicle, she said, but notes can be assigned. Find out if that note is assignable. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. You want to buy Gavin's debt? I want to understand my options, I said. My phone buzzed on the table. Caroline. The 8th call since the voicemail. I turned it, face down. I drove home that afternoon in Dale's truck. My house sits on a quiet acre in Franklin, Tennessee, the kind of property that doesn't announce itself from the road. Eleanor chose it. She said she wanted a house that looked like it had always been there. It does. Mature oaks, a covered porch, a kitchen garden she planted that I've kept alive through 9 growing seasons, mostly out of stubbornness. Inside, the house was exactly as I had left it 3 days ago. Dale had brought in the mail and turned on a lamp. I sat in the study and listened to the silence and did not call Caroline. At 6:47 p.m., she called again. I answered. Dad. Her voice was measured. Prepared. How are you feeling? I had a hip replacement, Caroline. I am 63, not 93. A pause. I was worried. Were you? Another pause. Longer. About the firm, she started. Don't, I said. Silence. Patricia has contacted Alderton, I said. The Secretary of State filing is being contested, and I've spoken to both lenders. I let that sit for a moment. You should talk to your husband. Her voice dropped. Dad, this wasn't meant to... I know what it was meant to do, I said. I'm not interested in the explanation tonight. I'm interested in what comes next. So is Patricia. So is Alderton's legal team. I ended the call. I did not feel angry. That surprised me. When Eleanor was sick, in those final months, I used to sit in this same chair and feel a grief so physical, it was almost structural, as if something in my skeleton had loosened. This felt different. Cleaner, like reading a contract and finding the clause that changes everything and knowing exactly what to do with it. 3 days later, Caroline and Gavin requested a meeting. Not at the office. At the house, which told me that Gavin had advised against neutral professional ground. He wanted the emotional terrain. The family table. The photos on the wall. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Caroline wore a jacket I recognized. Practical navy. The kind she wore to site visits. Gavin wore a suit. He was the only person at the table in a suit. Patricia sat to my right. I had not told them she would be there. Gavin's composure flickered when he saw her, just once. Then he recovered and extended his hand and smiled with just his mouth. I did not stand to shake it. We sat. Dale set coffee on the table and left the room. We want to talk about a path forward, Gavin began. So do I said. He nodded, encouraged. The restructuring was premature. We understand that. But the intention was to position the company for the next phase. Given what? I asked. He paused. Given your health situation? I had an elective hip replacement. I am in excellent health. Of course, but long-term, Gavin. I said his name the way I used to say it on job sites when a contractor was about to give me an excuse I didn't need. Flat. Final. Stop. He stopped. Patricia opened the folder in front of her. The amended Articles of Incorporation filed with the Tennessee Secretary of State on February 1st are legally defective, she said, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who has already won and is simply informing the other party of that fact. The power of attorney authorizing the filing did not extend to corporate governance. We have filed a formal objection with the Secretary of State's office and expect the amendment to be voided within 30 days. Caroline's jaw tightened. Additionally, Patricia continued, the representations made to Mercer Development's lenders regarding a leadership transition were made without authorization and may constitute fraud. We have notified both lending institutions. Gavin leaned forward. That's an overreaction. We were planning. You borrowed $340,000 against anticipated fees from the Alderton contract, I said. The room went very still. Gavin's face did something complicated. Caroline turned to look at him. You did what? She said. Her voice was quiet. That quiet that means someone is recalibrating something they thought they understood. It was a bridge loan, Gavin said quickly. While we structured the transition, there was no transition, I said. I never agreed to a transition. You manufactured one. Dad. Caroline started. Let me finish. I looked at her. You signed the amended articles. Her eyes dropped to the table. Did you know about the loan? I asked. A long silence. No, she said finally. Quietly. I believed her. That was the thing about Caroline. She had always been honest with me, even when the honesty was inconvenient. What she had done was let a man she loved convince her that what they were doing was inevitable, that I was declining, that the future of the company required action I hadn't yet agreed to take. She wasn't malicious. She was afraid. Of what happens when a father gets older, of being left holding something she hadn't been fully trusted to carry. That didn't make it right, but it changed what came next. I reached into the folder in front of me and produced a single document. Yesterday morning, I said, I acquired the note on Gavin's personal loan, the $1,340,000 bridge loan secured against anticipated Alderton fees. Gavin stared at the paper. The Alderton contract will be renegotiated under Mercer Development Group, which remains the legally authorized entity. The Alderton fees will not materialize under Strauss Advisory, because Strauss Advisory has no standing, which means the collateral underlying your loan is effectively worthless. I set the document down, and the note is now mine. Caroline looked at her husband. Something passed between them that I recognized. Not the look of two people in crisis together, but the look of a person seeing someone else's crisis for the first time. You can't use that as leverage, Gavin said, his voice thinner now. I purchased a debt instrument legally and transparently, I said. What you are describing as leverage is simply consequence. Patricia slid 2 additional documents across the table. A formal notice of unauthorized corporate filing, she said, and a request for full financial disclosure related to any transactions conducted under the fraudulent POA authorization. Both will be filed with appropriate regulatory bodies unless we reach an agreement today. Caroline picked up the disclosure request. Her hands were very still. What are you asking for? She said. She was talking to me now, not to Patricia, not to Gavin. I'm asking for honesty, I said. That's all I've ever asked. Her eyes filled, not dramatically, just the way eyes fill when something long-held breaks loose. I thought you were going to disappear, she said, like Mom did. I thought one day I'd come in and you'd be gone, and I'd be alone with all of it. And I didn't know if I was enough. The word enough hung in the air above the table. 31 years of building something, of showing up, of signing the documents and walking the sites and knowing where every beam was anchored, and my daughter had looked at all of that and seen, not legacy, but an absence waiting to happen. You should have said that, I said. I know. We looked at each other across the table for a long moment. Gavin sat between us, saying nothing, which was the most honest thing he'd done all afternoon. Here's what's going to happen, I said, turning back to include both of them. Gavin's loan will be restructured under market terms without preferential treatment and repaid according to schedule. The fraudulent corporate filing will be corrected through a joint submission to the Secretary of State. Gavin will resign from any operational role at Mercer Development Group. And Caroline. I paused. Caroline stays. In her current role, with a formal succession plan they'll be built together, over time, the way it should have been done. Gavin looked at the table. Caroline looked at me. Why? She asked. Because the company is named after your mother, I said, and your mother believed in you. She signed the agreement at 3:42 p.m. Gavin signed 18 minutes later, after a brief and apparently deflating private conversation with Patricia about the specific statutes under which the unauthorized filings could be prosecuted. They left before 4 o'clock. Caroline paused at the door and looked back at me. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. There are conversations that don't need words to start. They just need time. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that recovery is quiet, not empty, just slower. The Secretary of State voided the amended Articles of Incorporation on March 8th. Alderton's legal counsel confirmed the contract would proceed under Mercer Development Group as originally executed. Groundbreaking was rescheduled for late April, and I walked the site myself one Tuesday morning, moving carefully, but without the cane, watching the red clay of East Nashville turn under a backhoe, thinking about Eleanor, about what she would have said. She would have said I should have seen it coming. She would have been right. Gavin's consulting venture wound down quietly. The arbitration settled at a figure I was not privy to. He found work with a regional brokerage out of Chattanooga, which was far enough away to allow everyone to maintain a reasonable fiction of distance. Caroline and I met for lunch on the first Thursday of every month. We started in March with coffee. Cautiously, the way you approach something that's been repaired and hasn't been tested yet. By May, we were talking about the Alderton project. The way we used to talk about deals when she was new to the company and genuinely curious. By July, I showed her the trust documents for the first time, the ones Eleanor and I had structured 15 years ago, with Patricia's help, that placed the company's ownership in a layered entity designed to survive exactly the kind of crisis that had nearly occurred. Caroline read every page. She asked good questions, specific ones. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" she asked. "You didn't ask." She looked up. "That's not a fair answer." "No," I said. "It isn't. I should have shown you years ago. I thought protecting you from complexity was the same as protecting you. It wasn't." She folded the documents carefully and slid them back across the table. "So the amendment Gavin filed was a document attempting to transfer something that wasn't transferable," I said. "The trust owns the operating company. The POA covered me, not the trust." He built his plan on a foundation he hadn't bothered to examine. She was quiet for a moment. "He never asked you, did he? About any of it?" "No." "He assumed you hadn't planned." "Most people do." Outside, the Nashville summer pressed against the restaurant windows. A family walked past on the sidewalk, 2 small children pulling their parents in opposite directions. "I was scared," Caroline said. "I want you to know that I wasn't trying to cut you out. I was trying to make sure there was something left to inherit." "I know." "That's not an excuse." "No, but it's the truth, and the truth is a better starting place than most." She looked at me. "You didn't press charges?" "No." "Patricia said you could have." "Probably. Why didn't you?" I looked out the window at the street. A woman was walking a dog that was clearly walking her. The dog had somewhere to be. She was just along for the ride. "Because prosecution is a fire," I said, "and I've spent 31 years building things. I'm not interested in burning them down." The Alderton project broke ground on April 22nd, a cool morning with a thin layer of cloud cover that kept the temperature honest. I stood at the edge of the site in a hard hat that was slightly too large and watched the first excavation equipment move into position. Caroline stood beside me. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Dale handed me a coffee from the truck. I took it and wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth and thought about the voicemail. 14 seconds. I played it 3 times in a recovery room in February while the sedative wore off. The thing about betrayal, when it comes from someone you love, is that it doesn't feel the way you expect. You expect heat. What you get is cold. A flat, clinical recognition that something has been revealed rather than created. The betrayal was always there. You just weren't looking at the right wall. I didn't stop loving my daughter when she signed those papers. I stopped assuming that love was enough to substitute for honesty. That was the lesson Eleanor tried to teach me in those last months, when she was still strong enough to talk, and I was still unwilling to hear it. She said that leaving things unsaid doesn't protect people. It leaves them to fill the silence with whatever fears they're carrying. She was talking about her own illness. She was talking about everything. I walked to the center of the site, where the project manager was laying out the foundation grid, and I thought about what it means to build something that outlasts you. Not a monument, not a text, in the way people mean when they use that word loosely. Just something real, something that holds. My phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. Alderton's signature on the updated contract documents. Everything in order. I typed back 2 words. Good. Thank you. Then I put the phone in my coat pocket and stood in the cold April morning and watched the building begin. 3 months after Gavin left, on a Sunday evening in early June, when the air smelled like cut grass and someone 2 houses down was grilling. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't immediately recognize. A text from Gavin. Mr. Mercer. I want to apologize. I don't expect anything from it. I just needed to say it. I read it once, then again. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and went to the window and looked at the oak trees Eleanor had planted the year Caroline was born. They were enormous now. The kind of trees that make you understand how much time has passed. I picked up the phone and typed back. Honor your commitments. That's enough. He responded after a moment. Understood. I put the phone away and went back to the Sunday I'd been having before the text arrived. A book. A glass of sweet tea. The sound of whatever birds have discovered my yard since I stopped mowing the back section down to the creek. Sometimes, in the early mornings before the day has opinions, I sit on the porch with coffee and think about what I would have done differently, not about the legal response that I handled correctly. But before, in the years when I was stepping back and delegating and believing that trust was the same as communication, it wasn't. Trust is what you extend after communication has established it deserves to exist. Eleanor knew the difference. She tried to show me. What I know now at 63, 1 replaced hip, and 31 years of building things in this city is this. The people who love you are not always transparent about their fears. Sometimes those fears harden into decisions before they ever become conversations. The only answer I've found to that is structure. Not distance, not suspicion. Structure. Know where every deed is recorded. Know what every document authorizes. Show the people you love the architecture of the thing, so they don't have to guess at it in the dark. The company stands. The project will rise in East Nashville by next spring. Caroline shares the Monday operations meeting now, and she runs it the way Eleanor used to run the household. Efficiently, without drama. With a particular look she gives people who arrive unprepared that I recognize from 1,000 dinner tables. She has her mother's eyes. She has always had her mother's eyes. If you've ever been assumed finished, by illness, by age, by someone who loved you but stopped seeing you clearly, I hope you remember something simple. The plans you made quietly are the ones that hold. The documents you signed carefully are the ones that protect. And if someone tells you that you're declining, that the future has already been arranged, that it's already done, check the deed, read the trust, and walk onto that job site yourself. We're not finished until we decide we are. I've thought about that voicemail more times than I can count. 14 seconds. Caroline's voice measured and careful, the way it gets when she's already made up her mind and doesn't want an argument. And me, lying in a recovery room with an IV in my wrist, and a hospital blanket that smelled like industrial detergent, playing it back 3 times because I needed to be sure I'd heard it correctly. I had. What I've come to understand in the months since is that actions don't happen in a vacuum. Gavin didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray me out of thin air. He had borrowed money he couldn't repay. He had built something on a foundation he hadn't examined, and when the structure started to wobble, he reached for the nearest thing that looked solid, which happened to be a company I had spent 31 years building. Every consequence in that story traces back to a choice. His choices. Mine too. The years I stepped back without explaining why. The documents I never showed Caroline. The silence I mistook for protection. That's the part that stays with me. I did everything right legally. The trust was structured correctly. The POA was properly scoped. Patricia had reviewed every line, but I had done something wrong in a quieter way. I had kept the people I loved at arm's length from the architecture of the thing, and that distance became the space where fear grew into bad decisions. What carried me through wasn't anger. It was something I'd built over decades without fully naming it, a habit of preparation, of reading what other people skim, of understanding that clarity is not paranoia. It's just respect for reality. When the voicemail came, I wasn't panicked. I was already thinking. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from confidence. It comes from doing the work long before the crisis arrives, from knowing where every document is filed and what every clause permits and what your name is actually attached to. And underneath the legal maneuvering, underneath the forensic accounting and the Secretary of State filings and the debt acquisition, there was something simpler operating. I didn't press charges against my own daughter. I didn't accelerate Gavin's loan out of spite. I didn't burn the company down to prove a point, not because I'm a particularly forgiving man by nature, but because I understood that destruction is irreversible, and I had spent my entire career building things meant to last. The choice to contain rather than demolish, that was its own kind of discipline. The hardest kind, actually. The kind that doesn't get applause. Caroline is running Monday operations meetings now. She asks better questions than she did a year ago. Sharper ones, because she finally knows what she's looking at. We are rebuilding something that was always there, but never fully spoken. That takes longer than a legal filing. It takes longer than a court order. It takes showing up on the first Thursday of every month and having the conversation even when it's uncomfortable, even when the silence has run a little long. I am 63 years old. I have one replaced hip and 31 years of work standing in East Nashville. I am not finished. I never intended to be. And if there is anything worth passing forward from what happened to Caroline, to anyone watching a similar situation take shape around them, it's this. Do the work before the crisis. Tell the truth before the fear sets in, and hold the line, not because you want to win, but because some things are worth protecting with everything you have. The company is named after Eleanor. That's reason enough.